introduce her as well. Well, this is our first meeting of the PVA Task Force, and I want to thank everyone that's here live and virtual. And if we want to start the meeting, just to let everybody know that are out there in virtual land, if you have a question or concern, just use the chat function there where you can ask a question, put your hand up, and we will definitely call on you. And at this point, we'll just start with our roll call. And if whenever you answer, if you could say in person or virtual. Thank you.
Senator Harper Angel.
Here, virtual, in my district.
Thank you. Senator Nemes. Representative Heverin.
Here in person.
Representative Kulkarni.
Here, virtually in my district.
Thank you. Tom Crawford.
Here, virtually in my office.
Thank you. Co-Chair Mills. Co-Chair Bridges.
Very good. It looks like we're all here and accounted for. Mr. Crawford, thank you for being here as our only non-legislator on the panel. We're looking forward to your expertise over the next few months.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
You're very welcome. We have one presenter today. We have Mac Bussart. He's the Executive Director of the Kentucky PVA Association. And Mr. Bussart, we have plenty of time for you to go through your presentation, and then we will probably have some questions following, and we look forward to hearing from you and hearing what you had to present. So the floor is yours, sir, if you want to take off. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it, Chairman Mills. Thank you, committee members, for serving on this task force and taking the time to kind of see what the PVA world is like and hopefully help us with maybe some issues that we've got. And we just look forward to working with you on this. My hope today is to give you kind of a high-level view of the PVA world, to try to answer some of the questions that you've got, but to hopefully kind of give you a little bit of sense of the what a PVA does, how our funding is kind of set up, some of the things that we have looked at as efficiencies that maybe we could have some help with, that maybe would help all of us. So my presentation is going to be actually run from LRC staff. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll go to the next screen. Thank you. So this is the number one thing that PVAs do. If nothing else, this is absolutely the critical thing that PVAs do. We are responsible for assessing all real and tangible property at 100% of its fair cash value as of a January 1 assessment date. Real property is divided up into three categories, being residential, farm, and commercial. And then the tangible property we're responsible for include cars, boats, airplanes, trailers, business inventory, business furniture, and business fixtures. Some of those are self-reported, and I'll talk about those a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, please. Ad valorem tax structure. Ad valorem is Latin and means of value. And so our tax base for real property is based on its actual value. And in Kentucky, it is in our Constitution that it is 100% of our fair market value. We are kind of the third leg of, you hear about the three-legged stool of funding for the state. Property tax is one of those. We are a very stable function from that. We don't tend to fluctuate as much as income tax and sales tax does. We are the primary source of income for fiscal courts, schools, special taxing districts, and we produce over $3.2 billion in taxes annually, both state and local. Next slide, please. So by statute, to kind of give you a little bit of an overview, PVAs are state officers with county jurisdiction. We are in, us and our employees are in the KRS retirement system. our deputies are non-merit at-will state employees. Our fiscal courts are required by statute to provide office space, furniture, and utilities to a PVA office. In other words, the kind of things that any office would have to have in order to be able to conduct business. The Department of Revenue authorizes the PVA office budget, all 120 of them. The audits of each PVA office are the responsibility of the state auditor. We use agreed upon procedures, so there's a certain number of things that the auditor's office looks at when they go through an audit. And they normally try to audit 1 out of every 4 counties, they try to normally audit an office 1 out of every 4 years. So in other words, in a 4-year cycle, they would have looked at each county. Obviously, if something doesn't look right to them, they can come back as many times as they want to after that. And then the big thing is PVAs must have their assessments certified by the Department of Revenue annually. Next slide, please. So certifications rely on a sales ratio study. And these are using arm's length transactions. In other words, we're taking the entire sales that take place in a county, and we go through to verify that they are arm's length, meaning a willing buyer, willing seller, and they are measured using a ratio of the assessment to the sales price. So here's a couple of very simple examples. A house is assessed for $90,000, sells for $100,000. Its ratio is 90%. And if it was assessed at $110,000, it sold for $100,000, that ratio would have been 110%. So all the sales in the county, whether it's 30 sales, 300 sales, or 3,000 sales, they are all ranged in going from low to high. And then the median, that's not the average, but the number, if you had 30 or 31 sales, number 16 would be the center of that sale. And they would look at that sale, and it should be between 95 and 105%. Next slide, please. So when they're not between that, and I need to also let you know that the 95 to 105 is used when the sales include some that are older than a year. And then if they're all new sales, all within the last year, then that range goes from 90 to 110. But in this example, we're saying that the results were not between 95 and 105, that they were actually at 89, they were low. That median number showed 89%. And let's assume that the total assessment, real estate assessment in that county is $500 million. Well, to get to 95, you've got to raise 6%. So 6% of 500 million is 30 million. And so a PVA would have to reassess property to attain an additional $30 million before they would be certified by revenue. Next slide, please. So tax bills, quickly. The assessment that the PVA puts on a piece of property times the tax rate is equal to the amount of the tax bill. The tax rates are set by each taxing district individually, and then those are all added together, and that becomes a tax rate basically for a county in a certain district. House Bill 44 allows for increases of up to 4% of tax dollars collected from the previous year, and that's without a voter referendum. Now, that does not mean that one specific property could not be raised more than 4%. This is talking about the entire county's accumulated number of dollars that they would get. So if an assessment increases, then the districts can keep the same tax rate and still get a 4% increase in the revenue, up to 4%. And then if they decrease, then the districts can raise their rate to get the same revenue amount as they did the previous year, or they can actually go up to 4% should they choose to do so. Anything over 4%, then that becomes subject to a voter referendum. And typically, that doesn't take place. Most of them would take the compensating rate that they had from the prior year. Next slide, please. So what do PVAs do? And this is just going to give you some sense of the scope of work across the state. There are somewhere around 2.2 million properties statewide. Each of these properties have got to be mapped and identified as to ownership. Characteristic data is accumulated on those properties. So you have to measure the outside boundaries of the home. PVAs nor their deputies go inside a home ever. We're only looking at the outside square footage. We put those on sketches, and then we take photographs of the property. We're required to maintain the ownership information. We are typically the very best information available as to who owns a piece of property, and we get a lot of requests for that information sometimes. We're also, therefore, keep up with transferring the property record. So when a property sells, we take that on to the information on to the new purchaser. There's about 440,000 homestead and disability exemptions across the state, and there are specific rules for who gets a homestead exemption or a disability exemption and what has to be met in order to receive that. There are about 131,000 tangible property returns annually processed by the PVA offices. And we have nearly 5 million vehicles, boats, and campers. That does go through the county clerk's office, but the PVAs are responsible for assessing those properties. And so if there's ever a dispute as to the value of a property, then the county clerk will send them to the PVA office. Next slide, please. So we commonly hear from our taxpayers that you are raising my taxes. Well, we don't raise taxes, we assess property, and they reflect the market of the real estate sales in the county and hopefully within their subdivision. We're required to review all properties once every 4 years. So let's think about that just a second. So if you're in an area that's having 3% increase in, we'll say, inflation, home prices, over a 4-year period, your market has now gone up 12%. And so remember, we're kind of going back to that 90 and 110%. So if you're in a growing market, you're going to have to be really keeping up with that market and trying to increase the valuations based on those sales that are taking place in the county. The quadrennial plan, that's that once every 4-year plan, is sent to the revenue office. And what normally happens in that quad review are you're looking for not necessarily always new buildings or new stuff, because you're looking through that countywide every year. But you are looking to make sure that the pictures reflect the condition of the house, and you're reviewing the assessment on that property, and that typically is going to take place in that quad plan area. However, it does not have to. I mean, each property is supposed to be assessed at 100% of its value in any given year. But for the most part, PVAs will try to use that quad plan to make sure that they are covering the entire county. Next slide, please. So here's a sense of what kind of growth we've seen in the last several years. These are $1 billion, and for instance, from 2018 to 2019, that's roughly a $10 billion increase. And at a 12.2 cents per $100 valuation for a state rate, that's a little over $12 million that comes back to the state in additional income, additional funding. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, we always like to say what kind of return on investment does a given, business have, or, does it make sense that you reinvest dollars in an area? And I would say that our return on investment is outstanding. In 2017, and I'm using those figures, those are the last that are kind of fully available. Real and tangible property tax income to the state was $600 million. To the local districts was $2.6 billion. So that's a total income produced for the state and local taxing districts of $3.2 billion. The state expenditure for that year, I think, was around $56 million. And the local expenditure, and I'll get into the weeds a little bit better on that later, ends up being about $66.5 million. So our state income return, it's the $600 million to the $56 million, is about 11 to 1. The local districts, which include schools and health departments and libraries and and the fiscal courts, those return on investment is about 248 to 1, which is absolutely tremendous. And then the total income to cost to all districts is 48 to 1. And one of the reasons that that local tax district is so big, and I'll talk about that a little bit later as well, is that cities and counties are the only local entities that help provide for a PVA budget. So the other taxing districts do not. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit deeper in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So our PVA budgets come from, as I said, county and cities using the tax rolls. Cities are not required to use the PVA assessments, and there are a few, probably less than 4, that do their own assessing for their city tax rolls. There is a statutory formula that is calculated, and that's submitted to the counties and cities each year by revenue. Those costs are to be submitted back to, they're paid basically by September 1. And these are basically for personnel costs that were not covered by the state, basically. And then the remainder of those local funds are paid quarterly to a PVA office for running the office. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go into our funding a little bit and some of the ways that we have tried to stretch our budget in order to basically not have to lay off employees due to lack of funding. The deputies are extremely important to the process, and without those deputies, we could not make our statutory required assessments. Next slide, please. So in 2020, our general fund appropriation was a little over $56 million. It is only to be used for personnel cost. By state statute, we're supposed to have a minimum of 2 employees per county, and then that's in addition to the PVA. We have statewide presently 592.5 positions. Over the last 10 years, we have lost 38 of those positions, just basically due to not having the funding. And so due to attrition, we kind of came up with a formula basically to try to equally distribute our deputies as best we could. And basically that means we've lost those positions over time. Our local funds, which are used for operating expenses, amount to $11.6 million for this year. Again, these are funds that are used from the county and cities' use of the tax roll. there is a statutory formula that is used to tell the city and the county how much they're going to owe for the data. Then we also have miscellaneous funds from sale of maps, sale of tax rolls, data, and some counties print their tax bills. And then again, my little note, special districts don't pay anything. So that's something hopefully we might be able to look at in the future. Next slide, please. So common operating expenses for an office. And again, these are out of that local fund, that 11.6 million total. The PVA world is going to be different from most anything else in state government in that we collectively look at our individual budgets from the statewide perspective and come up with a formula each year that we bill back to our individual PVA offices to cover the amount of the shortfall that is not met by our appropriation. And so this year, we're going to be, and I'll get into some numbers for you in a few minutes, but we're going to be sending 73% of our total operating expense funds back to the Department of Revenue for use of paying basically the last 2 months payroll in order not to have to lay off our deputies. So in addition to that, then you've got the regular expenses any other business was going to have, where you've got vehicle cost or a mileage reimbursement, depending on the county, which is highly necessary for doing property inspections. We pay for our own computers, our own GIS systems, our own database software used in each office. Pictometry is a particular company that does aerial photography, but they are also able to do photography that is, it's actually at an angle, and you are able to get all four sides of a building. You can actually measure the building depending on how the accuracy of the imagery. And again, there's some savings there that we'll talk about a little bit later on. Postage for assessment notices that we have to have, and then regular printing, office supplies, school supplies, etc. Next slide, please. So how do we kind of do smoke and mirrors, if you will, to try to make sure that we, again, don't end up having to lay off deputies? So one of the things that we've done that we initiated in 2009 was if there's a deputy that leaves the office, whether it's retirement, they're changing employment, whatever reason, somebody leaves an office, there is a mandatory 90-day delay before you can hire somebody back into the office. Of course, that changes year to year because you never know how many people are retiring, etc. But just this last year, we saved our budget $840,000. And the annual savings is usually anywhere from $500,000 to $900,000. And as I mentioned earlier, we've lost 38 positions since 2010. If you remember, 2008, 9, 10, 11, those were the years that we were going through the, well, I don't guess it was called a depression, but it was a great recession. And so our association tried to figure out a way that if we were going to have to lose people, how might we do that so that it didn't adversely affect all of us? And so they came up with, a formula that basically came out to say what the number of employees given a certain workload should be. And if one of those exceeded that number and they lost a person due to retirement, etc., they were not able to hire that person back. And that's how we have ended up losing these 38 positions. The other thing that might ought to be noted to that is this does not help particularly those counties that have had great growth. And that same formula we used would say they should have had an extra person or half person in order to do their job correctly based on their workload. So that $1.5 million, it saved our budget, but it did not improve the quality of our work because we were working shorthanded still in those faster growing counties. Next slide, please. So here's what we think of as our real expenses. And to quickly go through that, 56 million was what was approved in our budget for this year. There are restricted funds of $3.5 million. Now, when it says restricted funds, that means that out of that 11.6 million we had for operational expenses, we're sending $3.5 million to fit the budget that was set for us. We are exceeding that by another $5 million this year in anticipation of, we know there's going to be some cuts, or we feel like there may be cuts to our budget. And because of the coronavirus effects and general downturn in state receipts. So we're trying to set ourselves to try to have a reasonable amount of dollars to hit. Excess vacancy credits, and we're calling that 500,000. We try to the best of our ability to allow the individual PVA in their office to decide how best to run their office. So if they think they can run their office one less person than what they were able to have based on those formulas, and they were going to have to pay, let's say, $28,000 for their portion of the shortfall, and there was a position that paid $38,000 that they weren't hiring, that's a $10,000 excess vacancy credit. And so that's where that $500,000 number comes from. The 90-day delay savings is, again, an average that I talked about a while ago. And the FAD savings, the FAD basically was our calculation to say how many employees a particular county should have. And so we are not funding those 38 positions at $1.5 million a year. So in our minds, our total cost of personnel is really about $67 million versus $56 million that we're getting through the state funding process. Basically, every position in the PVA office is frozen at a position and an incoming salary rate, if you will, that was in effect since 2008. So if a county had their own funds that were available to them, they are able to promote, but they're paying for it out of their own pocket. It's not anything that is hitting our state budget. And so overall, we're using about $1.6 million to try to pay for additional employees, again, and mostly in those counties that are showing large growth and just don't have enough help to get the job done without some additional employees. Next slide, please. So why should that really matter, and what's at risk? Well, if we don't have the personnel available to adequately get around a county and find the new properties and find those things, and that's money out of the tax district's pockets. New properties, the way they're calculated using House Bill 44, new properties are a windfall. They're not included in those numbers of only a 4% increase. So when we don't find new properties, it directly goes against basically the county and those local districts. Tax calendar is at risk. Because if we were doing the work with 6 people, but now we only have 5 people, everybody's having to step up. And there is, at some point, you're not gonna be able to do the same amount of work with less people. And the state tax rate cannot be set until 75% of the previous year's assessments are certified. So if several counties end up running late, and especially if they're larger counties, then that really has a serious hit on the tax calendar itself. And I gave just an example of, and this was probably, I said several years ago, this was probably more like 8 years ago. Now, Campbell County had a delay in setting their tax rates, so they couldn't send out their tax bills until 2 months later, only 2 months, but 2 months later than normal. And so a library was forced to borrow $250,000, and a school district had to borrow $176,000 in order to pay their employees and their other bills. And the tax calendar, and we'll try to hit that at a later meeting. But the tax calendar, everything is kind of synchronized, and it all has to hit in step, or it can have a fairly serious delay in what takes place. Next slide, please. So here's some thoughts that we've had about how we could help our PVA funding situation, so we didn't have to go back every 2 years and put at risk the tax calendar and how much money was needing to be coming in. So in 1978, the state real property tax rate was 31.5 cents per hundred. Today, because of the effects of House Bill 44, it's 12.2 cents per hundred. And our thought is that if we could dedicate a portion of that state tax rate, we could fund property tax completely. So next slide, please. So we bring in $3.2 billion. 2019, the real property assessment was about $269 billion. 1 cent of a state tax rate yields approximately $25 million. Our budget was set at $56 million. According to what I showed you earlier, our fully funded actual rates would be closer to $67 million. And so if we had a dedicated rate of 2.7 cents per $100 of the state rate, then that would meet our personnel cost. And basically, we think it would let property tax fund the property tax structure, property tax system. And we believe that this would help ensure that the Commonwealth gets all the funds that they're eligible for, and that it would prevent us from having issues that come up from lack of personnel. Next page, please. So in terms of other thoughts that we've had, one of the things, and again, as we mentioned, the special districts don't pay anything for the use of the rolls. So we think it would be reasonable to enact a fee for their use of the tax roll. And at this point, I'd like to thank Chairman Mills for sponsoring Senate Bill 241 this last year in order to try to help drive a conversation and see if that maybe would be able to go somewhere. So thank you for that, Chairman.
You're welcome. That's what put me here.
Well, I kind of wondered that myself, so I understand. One of the other things that we looked at was the county and the cities do contribute funding for PVA offices, and the formulas that were developed and used were put together, I think, in the 1940s. The fundings do have cap limits. So we thought maybe enacting a CPI to gradually increase the limits for all the different levels. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that the last 2 budget cycles, the legislature has increased the upper limits of those upper limits of the local funding for the largest jurisdictions. And basically those that were 5 billion and above, and this last time, those that were 15 billion and above got a bigger increase than we've had in the past. And that's certainly been beneficial, and we certainly want to thank the legislature for recognizing that. Our other thought was we always hear, look at fees. Fees might be something that would be possible to try to enact. And so a fee attached to a tax bill, and there's approximately 2.2 million tax bills each year. So again, that's some of the thoughts that we've had. Next page, please. So here's some of our own thoughts about some of the efficiencies that we've seen, some of the cost savings, some of the things that maybe might be beneficial to all of us. Next slide, please. So we have, and this took place, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago. And it's a master agreement, basically looking at commonly used software. And in this case, it was the ESRI, who is the national leader in the mapping world, in the GIF world. They have a large number of softwares that are very beneficial to the PVA use. And so we were able to enter into a master agreement whereby PVA offices paid a part of a master agreement. I think we were paying something like $100,000 collectively, and revenue was paying maybe $100,000 to $120,000. And we were able to basically my understanding is statewide agencies were all able to use that for a master agreement. So I think it was a substantial savings. I know it was in the PVA world, and I believe it was in several of the other state government industries, cabinets rather. So we're thinking maybe we might try to be able to do that with some other processes. Clear and LexisNexis are just two different information services. You can get on those and find out somebody's primary residence and those kind of things. PVAs have used their own operating monies to purchase subscriptions to those in the past. And basically it lets them check compliance for homestead and disability exemptions, because you can only have those in one county at a time and you can't have them in multiple states. And so this is very good for that. And also, if we get returned tax bills back, they come back to the sheriff when they send them. The sheriff in turn brings them back to the PVA office, and we can use these kinds of information services to find the right address for that taxpayer and resend the bill out. Then the pictometry, and again, that's a particular service, and there are other services out there, but we have talked at length among ourselves about a statewide flight that would be less expensive than individual counties doing those flights. And there might be some ways to try to partner with some of the other entities that would all like to use those statewide flights. And then as a part of that, there is a technology called Change Finder. And this is an application that was developed by the pictometry folks. And that's basically where you have an old map flight that is superimposed with a new flight. And it, in fact, can point out the new construction, the differences between those two flights. So if there's been a property built or added onto in that intervening time between those two map flights, it actually brings those up, highlights them. And so a PVA and their office staff would be able to more particularly be able to know this is something we definitely need to go get a picture of and review this as opposed to a shotgun approach where you just had to go out across the county and try to look at each individual property to see if it looked like it'd been changed. Next slide, please. This is a kind of a minor thing, but our PVAs are like all other elected officials, have statutes in place for continuing education. And our particular statute refers back to being in classroom. And so that means that there's a little bit of, online classes have not been heavily used because of this physical classroom kind of thought. And so our thought, and this is again from several years, is that online classes would be less expensive, and especially during this coronavirus would certainly be something heavily to look at. And just as recently as about 2 weeks ago, revenue allowed us to take our 40 required hours this year from virtual classroom style trainings. So something like this teleconference or something would maybe not this particular one, but a teleconference related to a workshop will count toward those 40 hours. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Commissioner Tom Miller and Executive Director Tom Crawford for helping making that possible. So this year we'll be able to get our 40 hours through online classes where we have not in the past. But it might still be good to go ahead and make a slight adjustment in the statute. So once we're finally over a coronavirus new normal, it still might be nice to be able to get those teleconference credits. So again, something to think on. Next slide, please. So this, and again, it's just trying to look at mailing cost and would you not be able to save a considerable amount of money by using email addresses rather than a physical mailing address for everything? And I know there's a lot of other facets to it rather than just property tax, and using email maybe as the same thing as mail. But if there's any way that we could do that, we do think it could be a considerable savings to individual counties and their offices. Next slide, please. This one would cost some money to develop, but it could have, I think, a fairly significant return. Tangible returns are self-reported, meaning that an individual or their CPA sends a form in to the PVA office. That form is then hand typed into what's called the Pvas system. Then it is sent to revenue in a file form once we've gotten all those in. And then it's returned back to the PVA office when things are certified. So it's included in the tax roll and becomes part of that certification. We think we're acting kind of as a middleman, and if there was a way that the individual taxpayer could send that directly to revenue as a set electronic form, then we think that would eliminate key punch errors and probably get more filings from the CPAs than maybe what we do. There's another kind of thought to this as well, that, as I mentioned, I think we use this Pvas system, which is the vehicle system in the state, to input these tangibles. But there's a new system called Pvas that is going to be, well, it's already in place to a limited extent. And my understanding is that, one of the things they want to do with Pvas is no longer have to have Avis has a upkeep and to keep that going. Well, the way we enter our reports right now, Avis is the only thing that's out there, so they could not do away with it and us still be able to enter in those tangibles. Next slide, please. And this is kind of been happening over the last 3 or 4 years. Revenue Office of Property Valuation has paid for internet in local offices that are on the state network. We have found over some years that there are instances where a county local provider can be faster and cheaper. And so trying to get the efficiency within their office, they're trying to upgrade their networks. And so that's costing them money in their office. And at the same time, it's saving a little money in the state. But we just think it might not be a bad idea to review that situation and see, maybe there's something that we could do out there. Maybe a better way to do it. I don't know. Next slide. So here's some things that I see kind of on the horizon that we ought to be kind of watching for. The latest I heard, I think just a couple of weeks ago, is potential funding cuts of 13 to 17% from the state due to the pandemic. And as I mentioned, we had built in a little bit of funding cuts in what we were going to be sending back to try to make sure we didn't have to lose deputies. But there's no way we can cover a 13 to 17% cut. Just can't be done without losing a considerable number of deputies. I don't know if y'all have heard of what's called a dark store appraisal. This has been primarily in the north, Wisconsin, Michigan. Some of these funding cities and counties have really been racked by these appraisals. And what they're doing, companies, and these are what they call big box store companies, and those are typically like Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, Kroger, and really what happened is some really sharp attorneys started saying, hey, we need to assess these as if the store was closed and not an ongoing business, but a closed store. And that's why they call it dark store, because it'd be closed. So what they're starting to do is, and oftentimes, as a way of an example, let's say, and I won't use a particular store, but let's just say a big box store moves and builds a new place 2 miles from where its original building was. And they put in there that there cannot, before they sell that property, they put covenants in it like they can't, whoever buys it cannot put in a store similar to what their store was. So that limits the market for that particular thing. Then it sells and it becomes, say, an antique mall or something. Well, it sold a lot less at that point than an ongoing business would have been. And so it is really decreasing the assessments in some of these other states, and we are now starting to see that being tested. We've gotten one store that is before the Court of Appeals. The PVA County won in local court, won in the state valuation court, and is now being heard in the Court of Appeals. So we may be coming back to y'all at some point asking for some specifics that would help kind of keep that in check. And then another area, and this is where I was talking about where people sell data according to a commercial fee schedule. And we're seeing large corporations hungry for information and data, but they tend to think that that ought to be free or practically free rather than abide by our commercial fee schedule. So we're starting to see some lawsuits regarding that. And again, if we lose that, that'll be a significant amount of funding that has basically kept us afloat through all these other cuts over the years. And we don't really know how we would make up that difference without some significant help. And I've got one more item that I neglected to put on my list, and that revolves around the documented boats. These are large boats that are in basically, I guess a third of the state's counties, 40 counties plus, this is an issue. And it really is about fairness, because we're estimating that somewhere between 25 and maybe 35% of the documented boats actually are on the tax rolls and paying some fair amount, which means basically 2/3 of those boats are not paying anything. And we just see that as not being equitable. We see it as not only our schools and fiscal courts and these other jurisdictions not being funded to the level that they should have been funded based on our current law, but it's just flat not fair the way that process has been going on. And hopefully at maybe one of our other sessions, we can talk about documented boats a little bit length. So my next slide, if you please. So that concludes my overview, and I'll be glad to try to take questions as I can. And if I can't answer something, that's one of the really good things I think about this task force, is it'll give us an opportunity to have other folks come in at a little later date, maybe be able to hit things a little more in detail than I did.
Very good. Mr. Bushart, thank you so much. That was a very good presentation, pretty detailed, but yet it was a summary too, so I thought it was effective. Just wondered, before we start with questions, Mr. Crawford, did you have anything that you'd like to add there, that any thoughts that popped into your mind during that presentation that you think might be valuable to us?
Well, thank you. Yes, I thought it was a very thorough and excellent presentation by Mr. Bushart. He did talk about some other aspects of the PVA office that we'll hit on at a later date, I suppose, like the property tax calendar and tax bills, that type of thing. Those are all going to be very important issues for us to explore as well. So we'll be interested in hearing more about that later. But no, I think he summarized the issues facing PVAs, especially from the funding side, very well. And I think there are some definite things we need to discuss in the coming months.
Very good. And I'll open it up for questions, live or virtual, if anybody has a few questions. And we'll try to maybe make this about 20 minutes or so we can get out of here by maybe about 4:15. Okay. Representative Bridges has a couple questions. Co-Chairman Bridges.
First off, I want to tell Mike I appreciate all the work and effort you put into this. I know we've been discussing this for probably about 6 or 8 months for the task force, and looking for redundancies and savings and everything. I appreciate what you brought up. You've brought up a lot more than what I expected, and I'm pleasantly surprised at this, especially the areas of the savings of what we could look at through the pictometry, GIS, things of that nature, the large boats, the dark store appraisals. As a realtor and a broker, I understand how that affects the market, and these are all things we need to address. So I really don't have as much of a question. It's just an appreciation to share with you how much I appreciate you worked on this and willing to work with us on this. And Tom, we've talked once, and look forward to future conversations of ways we can look at how the revenue department will interact with this too. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Nemus has a question or comment.
Yes, thank you very much for this concise report. I have a question on the dark store appraisals. That's virtually your best use value in real estate that you're putting that appraisal at. But is it really the best use if they can't use it for that? If there's restrictions in when they buy it?
I will tell you that it's been quite a while since I took an appraisal course, but you're exactly right that the highest and best use is kind of the tenet, if you would, in the appraisal theory that this kind of goes across the grain, kind of doesn't really, they don't use that very well, I think. But I will tell you there are a lot better appraisers than I am that could do a better job of explaining that to you. And hopefully we can look at this in a future meeting and really try to get down into it, because it really has negatively affected jurisdictions, not just north. I think it was also Alabama, Texas. If you kind of Google dark store or big box kind of things, it's pretty significant, the negative effect it's had on jurisdictions. And in Kentucky, the way we're set up with House Bill 44, where a jurisdiction is still going to be able to get basically the same amount as they got last year, what that's going to do is it's going to turn it's going to reduce, if it's enabled, it's going to reduce commercial property values, which in turn is going to raise the rates for everybody else, which is going to be basically residential. So your residential folks would pay a higher portion of the amount of tax dollars than these ongoing, well-run businesses. And we just think that's something that ought to be looked at.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to look at that too, because in the example you gave, if that was the only thing on the dark store appraisals, I would question that, because you would have a new store with a higher value and then the old store that would have the lower value because they couldn't use it as the best use. You just can't use it. So, yes, I'm interested in looking at that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, may I respond to that?
Absolutely, go ahead.
I probably didn't do a really good job of following through on that line of thought. What's happening is these companies are wanting to take that sale of that devalued property and use it as a comparison property with that new one that was just built. So they're trying to say that because the old store, which no longer could be used for what it had been used for in the past, which was probably its highest and best use, now because it's gone to something in a secondary market and brought a lower price, that's the value that it ought to be compared to the brand new building that's just been constructed and has got great income, but they're saying it ought to be based on this secondary purchase.
That makes sense.
So,
yes, thank you.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Any other questions? I just had one question, Mac, if you could just elaborate. Have fire district schools and libraries, those special taxing districts, have they ever paid for the use of the tax rolls? And if they did, what prompted the change where they're at now, where they do not pay for it?
To my knowledge, they have never paid for any part of the use of the tax roll. There are some instances, and I'll say fire districts, for instance, that they may be on at we'll say membership driven, like you pay $25 or $50 to be a member of that fire district. And that is labor intensive on that PVA office to identify who might supposed to get a bill. And the thing is, they were trying to put them on the tax bill itself. And so, in some cases, I know they have agreed to pay a modest sum to try to help cover the workload, or, you know, maybe buy that PVA office a computer, or just, you know, kind of a barter system, honestly. But that's the only thing that I'm aware of in terms of any of the special districts. To my knowledge, they have never been required to pay anything for use of the tax roll.
In, just a follow-up question on that similar, in your national associations that I'm sure that PVAs go to and hear talks, are there other states where schools and special taxing districts do pay for the production of the tax rolls or pay a fee?
I'm not aware of that, but I think that's something that we should certainly look into. I am not aware of that.
Okay.
And by the way, we do have a national organization, and it's IAAO, International Association of Assessing Officers. And we prescribe pretty much to their standards of appraisal. We are actually mass appraisers, if you would. That's kind of the role of the PVA. And so there's certain processes and that kind of thing that IAAO has set kind of benchmarks for us. My understanding is too, that's kind of where revenue uses their ratio studies. We all tend to try to follow what we see as best practices in that regard.
Very good. Senator Harper Angel has a question virtually. Senator Harper Angel, we cannot hear you if you're talking. Oh, is it? Okay. Senator, you may check your microphone was muted.
Chairman Mills,
Yes, there we go. Now we
I'm
can
so-
hear you.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. Go ahead.
Technical issues. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to put together this task force and my ability to serve on it. I think some of the folks there know I was the PVA in Jefferson County for 16 years and also a deputy in that office for 16 years prior to being elected. And I think Mac Bussard has given a great overview of the duties. He referred to it as the PV world, which I can testify is a tough world. And I really hope that this task force will investigate thoroughly the need for a permanent funding mechanism for the PVA offices, be it special districts or an additional fee. Property tax needs to fund property tax. And I look forward to continuing to serve, and thank you so much for the task force.
Very good. If there are no other questions, and that kind of rolls right into Senator Harper Angel's comment there, is that I would suggest that members of the task force plug into their local PVAs and ask questions and possibly send out a couple of emails. I've done that in my district to get some feedback on the local PVAs that we represent, what some of their challenges and interests are. So we have 4 more meetings, and then we're charged with putting together a document in December that can launch into possibly some legislation. So if you have any comments or questions or concerns, feel free to email myself or Representative Bridges, and we will try to get guest speakers in that you might think are good, even your local PVA or or anybody that you'd like to have come and speak. So if not, our next scheduled meeting is, got it here, August the 18th at 3 o'clock. So that's a Tuesday meeting at 3 o'clock. So if there's not any other questions or concerns, we'll stand adjourned until then. Thank you so much.